Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Bangladesh, the South Asian country that's home to nearly 170 million people, has a new government.
This Bangladesh has been reborn. Our resolve is to see it move ahead at a very rapid pace. That is what we want to protect.
After weeks of protests that led to some 400 deaths, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina was forced to step down and flee the country, putting an abrupt end to her 15 years in power.
This is not just the end of the tyrant Sheikh Hasina. With this, we put an end to the mafia state that she has created.
In a startling turn of events, Nobel Prize-winning economist Muhammad Yunus stepped into the leadership vacuum. Yes, the same Muhammad Yunus, who we reported just last month, was facing nearly 200 criminal charges that his supporters believed were politically motivated. Earlier, Yunus told Bloomberg that he didn't have political aspirations. But after Hasina's departure, he was chosen to be the chief advisor of the interim government.
We must protect this freedom, and not only protect it, but take the fruits of this freedom to every household. Otherwise, this freedom has no value.
What happens next in Bangladesh is being closely watched by international investors who've come to see the country as a potential rising economy.
Bangladesh, when it was inaugurated as a nation, as an independent nation in the 1970s, was something like the second poorest country on earth. Now it's a lower middle income economy. So it's seen as a fairly robust success story in the region. And I think that reputation is what's at stake.
Bloomberg reporter Schultz has been closely covering the events in Bangladesh over the last few months. And he says one thing Muhammad Yunus's interim government will need to do is to shore up confidence in the country.
One of the things that Yunis and his interim government will want to do is just ensure the international community that this is still a place to park their money, that it's a country that still has a very positive trajectory.
Welcome to the Big Take Asia from Bloomberg News. I'm Oanh Ha. Today on the show, how student protesters toppled a 15-year rule in Bangladesh, and what's next for Bangladesh's economy. Kai, we spoke last month about the celebrated economist Muhammad Yunus, whom you met earlier this year in Bangladesh. He was then fighting very serious criminal charges that his supporters believed were being driven by former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. And now, weeks later, we have such a dramatic turn. Hasina's resigned abruptly and has fled the country, while Yunus is now in charge of an interim government. Did anyone see this coming?
Nobody saw this coming. It's been a complete shock. It's wild that Yunus is the leader of the interim government precisely because he was such a target of Hasina's administration, or at least it was perceived that way by him and his camp. He faced life imprisonment, and now he's ruling over a massive country. And many now are hoping that this ushers in a new era for the country, but with so much uncertainty, it's hard to say.
Okay, so take us back to the protests in July that led to the prime minister's ouster. What got people to the streets?
The protests started with fairly narrow agenda points. Mostly, they were on the streets contesting a law that preserves government jobs for specific groups.
So wait, why did protesters care so much about these jobs?
So under the quota system, about 30% of jobs were reserved for the families of veterans who fought in Bangladesh's War of Independence. Hasina's party, the Awami League, was instrumental at that time in pushing for Bangladesh to become an independent nation. So many students felt like this system favored loyalists of hers. And Bangladesh's economy has lately slowed. There's still a sense, particularly among young people, that quality jobs are in short supply. So the protest movement was largely led by students, at least initially.
And how did the then Prime Minister Hasina react to the protests and criticism?
Prime Minister Hasina reacted with force in those early days.
The army has now been deployed in the country's capital to enforce a strict curfew with a shoot-on-sight order.
And the way they cracked down was by deputizing the police, eventually the army, shutting down communications so that people couldn't as easily organize.
With the government imposing a nationwide internet blackout. The U.S. Embassy in a statement saying reports indicate hundreds have been injured, adding the situation is extremely volatile.
For several days, WhatsApp was basically unusable. So internet services, phone communications, all of that was cut. And the protests became very violent. According to figures that we have, which are pulled from a variety of sources, including hospitals, several hundred people were killed, perhaps more than 400.
Okay. So you've got Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. She's been ruling Bangladesh with an ironclad fist and took a really strong stance against these protests, forcefully suppressed the demonstrations. And then weeks after, she's basically resigned abruptly, fled the country. What was the turning point here?
So at one point, several days into the protests, Hasina's administration made a concession. The veterans' quota was cut to 5%, and that seemed to quell a lot of the anger. The protests died down, but soon after, and it's unclear exactly why this occurred, the protesters returned, and when they returned, they wanted her to resign. And we think that part of the reason that these persisted was because by that point, a few hundred people had already been killed. And Bangladeshis were so tired of living in a country that they felt did not have a justice system that favored them, but had a justice system that favored the elite. And their agenda narrowed to a single bullet point, which was effectively to push her out. The streets of Dhaka were at their bloodiest. I think the day before she resigned, something like 100 people alone were killed. And that's really the moment when a lot of security personnel felt like they could no longer protect Sheikh Hasina and they could no longer stand behind her administration.
So Hasina resigns, and Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, steps in to lead the interim government of Bangladesh, backed by the military. What happens next here?
What happens next is the interim government will start to put together an agenda to rebuild Bangladesh, to take the country forward. Right now, ideally, elections would be held within 3 or so months. I think it's a 90-day period. So there are a lot of moving pieces at the moment. Hasina herself may come back to Bangladesh and contest elections. But it could be a situation where they're held in 3 months. It could be a situation where they're held in 2 years. We really don't know.
I imagine that the next few weeks will be really important to reestablish, security for Bangladesh. What are the most important things that Yunis and the military need to do to get daily life in Bangladesh, running smoothly again?
Right now, a lot of services simply aren't working. So the police were on strike. Many businesses are still shuttered. They're worried about arsonists, about looters. After Sheikh Hasina left, after she fled to India, the protests continued in some sort of spirit. And in many parts of the country, they continued to be violent. So we've encountered reports of minority Hindus being attacked. There's a sense that if Bangladesh doesn't get a hold of the security situation, it could become another Pakistan, in the sense that it could be a place that harbors Islamist extremists. And so I think that will be top of the agenda in the immediate month for Yunis and for the military, establishing some sense of security, at least in the capital and the bigger cities in Bangladesh.
And what are the risks here to Bangladesh's economy? It is the second largest garment exporter next to China.
The garment exports industry has been disrupted, of course, by the protests, by curfews. So a number of factories have temporarily shuttered as these protests became very intense. Much of the industry is centralized around Dhaka, the capital, where many of the protests were held. So there's been a bit of a spillover effect. Foreign direct investment has been falling pretty rapidly in Bangladesh for a few years. Bangladesh suffered immensely from the pandemic and supply chain disruptions. Bangladesh Bank's governor recently resigned. There's been enormous shakeup in the finance ministry, which is creating quite a bit of turbulence, at least in the present moment.
After the break, Bangladesh heads into an uncertain future with a reluctant leader. What does Muhammad Yunus have planned for Bangladesh now that he's in charge? Kai, this is a very dramatic turn of events in Bangladesh. When you visited Muhammad Yunus earlier this year at his home in Dhaka, he was facing a very different future. How did he go from facing life in prison to leading the country?
It's hard to know exactly why he was chosen. He was the person that student protesters wanted to lead this interim government. He's an intellectual. He's someone who is mostly apolitical, and I think that a lot of Bangladeshis gravitate toward that. They're tired of the same leaders with the same agendas constantly fighting each other. And Professor Yunus offers something different in that sense. But it's absolutely crazy that he is now completely out of the legal entanglements, at least for the time being, that he previously faced. The charges against him have been dropped. He was once a chief threat to Hasina, at least in the eyes of many people who are close to her, and he's now in her seat.
So one thing I wanted to touch upon is there is a bit of deja vu here, right? This is not the first time that Yunus stepped into politics under turbulent circumstances.
That's right. He briefly entered politics in 2007 when Hasina was in jail, and she saw that as a betrayal of sorts. He quickly stepped out. He realized that it was not for him. And he's insisted, including in interviews that I've conducted with him earlier this year, that he has no interest in politics.
I said, look, I'm not a politician. This is the last thing I will ever do.
Yeah, and that was a conversation you had with him just earlier this year. What did you take away from that conversation?
I took away that this is someone who's very dedicated to poverty alleviation. He did not strike me as someone who had political ambitions. It did not feel like that was just something he was saying to get Hasina off his back. My sense now is the student protesters asked him to be the interim head. That's something we do know as a fact. Whether he wanted to do it or whether he felt pressure to do it because the situation in Bangladesh was so unstable is still an open question. I think we'll have more clarity in the coming days, but for now, it's certainly a bit of an about face, and we'll see whether this is just a temporary step into the political arena or whether he might himself contest elections when they are held.
And Kai, how do you think this turbulent episode has changed how the world looks at Bangladesh?
I think that there's been an impression, at least within governments, that Bangladesh has slid toward a more authoritarian model. But at the same time, it's still one of the few Muslim democracies in the world. It's a country of contradictory elements. Sheikh Hasina was one of Asia's longest serving leaders. She presided over a pretty secularized nation, a place where religious minorities could worship in peace. So there's a sense that Bangladesh was a special nation, is a special nation, that it's a place that's made enormous strides to improve its economy and to move up the value chain. But I think with these latest protests, there's much darker impression that the country could become far less stable. And so there's a lot less optimism, at least at the moment.
So when will we actually have a sense of what the future looks like for Bangladesh?
Right now, Yunus's interim government has focused most of their rhetoric on restoring peace to the streets. Once we have a better sense for their actual agenda, I think we'll have more clarity on, number one, how long the interim government could be in place and how long it may take for elections to be held. And number two, whether the two traditional parties in Bangladesh, the Awami League and the BNP, are likely to be the power brokers in the future, or whether Yunis could be starting a new movement for the country and a new political agenda, really, for Bangladesh. But for now, it's a watch and see situation.
This is the Big Take Asia from Bloomberg News. I'm Oanh Ha. This episode was produced by Yang Yang, Naomi Ng, Jessica Beck, and Alex Sugiura, who also mixed it. It was fact-checked by Thomas Slew and edited by Caitlin Kenny. Special thanks to Andy Mukherjee. Our senior producers are Naomi Shavin and Kim Gettelson. Our senior editor is Elizabeth Ponso. Nicole Beamsterboer is our executive producer, and Sage Bauman is Bloomberg's head of podcasts. Please follow and review the Big Take Asia wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps new listeners find the show. See you next time.